Hello and good afternoon from Jakarta. Welcome to today's FPCI GRIPS Virtual Public Forum on Geopolitical Landscape, update on Russian invasion of Ukraine and its impact on Indo-Pacific political security dynamic. I'm Dito, and I will be the master of ceremony for today's event. This public forum is brought to you by Foreign Policy Community of Indonesia and National Graduate Institute for Policy Studies, GRIPS Japan. It's the first forum of this year's FPCI GRIPS Virtual Public Forum Series. Today, I'm pleased to welcome around 400 participants from across Indonesia and also from abroad, tuning in to our channels. We have attendees from 33 countries, including Japan, the Philippines, Malaysia, Singapore, the United States, Bangladesh, Ghana, Morocco, and many more. Before we go into the discussion, let us start this event with a few welcoming remarks by Ambassador Masato Watanabe, Senior Fellow at GRIPS Alliance and former Japanese Ambassador to Bangladesh. Ambassador Watanabe, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm Masato Watanabe. Thank you for joining us today at this FPCI GRIPS Virtual Public Forum, co-organized by FPCI and GRIPS. FPCI and GRIPS started joint programs 2 years ago, including public forum on various international issues and the Southeast Asia-Japan Track 1.5 dialogue. GRIPS wishes to further develop such productive working relationship with FPCI this year. Japan's relationship with ASEAN spans half a century. Japan and ASEAN are planning a special summit meeting in December to celebrate the 50th anniversary. It is important that we continue to promote intellectual exchanges with ASEAN scholars and researchers. The theme of today's public forum is very important: geopolitical landscape, update on the Russian invasion of Ukraine and its impact on Indo-Pacific political security dynamic. Prominent scholars from ASEAN, Australia, and Japan will share their views on this topic. A year and a half has passed since the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The prospect of Ukraine's counteroffensive is uncertain. It is a tragedy for the Ukrainian people that there is no end in sight to the conflict. The fact that Russia, a superpower and nuclear power, is a party to this conflict continues to threaten global security, not only in Europe, but also in the Indo-Pacific region. There is a difference in the response between Western countries and countries like Singapore, which take a tough stand against Russia, and not a few countries of the global South, as well as China. At the G7 Hiroshima summit in May this year, the issue of Ukraine was discussed between the outreach countries, including Indonesia and Australia, and the G7, with Japan serving as a bridge to the global South. During the discussions, Japan sought to reach a common understanding on principles such as no unilateral attempts to challenge the status quo by force and upholding a free and open international order based on the rule of law. Now, due to the mutual distrust between Ukraine and Russia and the hostile relationship between Russia and NATO countries such as the United States, an early end to this conflict may not be easy or feasible in the near future. In the meantime, in September, the G20 summit in India and the East Asia summit in Indonesia will be held. And in November, the APEC summit will be held in San Francisco, United States. The focus of the international community will be on how the countries of the region, including ASEAN, Australia, and Japan, can respond to this ongoing global crisis. I look forward to an exchange of views on the analysis of the current situation of the Russia-Ukrainian conflict and its political, security, and economic impacts on the Indo-Pacific. I'm also interested in a lively discussion among experts on how ASEAN and countries such as Australia and Japan should and could respond to the situation for the sake of peace and stability in the Indo-Pacific. Last but not least, I hope that the ASEAN and Japanese audiences who participated in today's public forum will continue to participate in future events organized by FPCI and GRIPS. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Ambassador Watanabe, for your welcoming remarks. To proceed, I would now like to give the floor to Dr. Dino Patijalal, founder and chairman of Foreign Policy Community of Indonesia. Pak Dino, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Watanabe-san. How are you? It's good to see you. I'm wearing my Global Town Hall T-shirt, and it was lovely to see you and Imura-san, Ambassador Imura-san in Tokyo, where we agreed we would extend our cooperation, FPCI GRIPS Virtual Public Forum. And this is the first of the series of 5. And I really enjoy working with GRIPS, and I know that our discussions, our seminars have really been of high quality and generated quite a lot of interest. And today alone, we have participants from 33 countries. And I think since we began to cooperate, we've had 4,000 participants joining our forums. So that speaks a lot about the utility of our collaboration. I don't want to add more to what Ambassador Watanabe-san has said, other than underlying that there is a variety of responses in the Indo-Pacific towards the Ukraine war. Even in some countries, they don't even want to describe it as an invasion, right? My group FPCI in Indonesia, we've been very clear about our stance that we oppose Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and we hope that Russia will abide by all the UN resolutions pertaining to this issue, because this is an issue where the contour of the world order hangs. This is a blatant violation of independent countries' sovereignty, independence, democracy, and human rights. The responses from Asia had been very, as I said earlier, there's no doubt that the repercussions or the impact of that war is being felt one way or another in different degrees to Asian countries, and certainly for Indonesia as well. So agree also that 2 years on, we're not seeing the end of it. There's no end in sight, and I'd love to hear the assessment of all the panelists regarding the end game, the prognosis on what would happen in the coming month or years as a result of this war. So I'll stop there, but really thank you all the panelists, and thank you GRIPS for your friendship and cooperation, and let's enjoy this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your remarks, Pak Dino. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, let us start today's discussion. Allow me to invite our moderator, Nesha Amelia, FPCI Woman in Foreign Policy Fellow. To Nesha, the floor is yours.
Hello, thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. Sorry about the technicality. So thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. And thank you, Mr. Dino Patijalal from FPCI, as well as Ambassador Masato Watanabe of GRIPS, the National Graduate Institute for Policy Studies in Tokyo, for having me. We will start the discussion soon. But let me just allow me to introduce again our speaker for today. Ladies and gentlemen, to address these developments, we are joined here today. Our first speaker is Professor Rory Nika from the Australian National University. He's the head of the National Security College. We have Dr. Yoro Sahashi, who is the associate professor from Institute of Advanced Studies for Asia at the University of Tokyo, and Iza Ibrahim, who is the analyst of Foreign Policy and Security Study Program from ISIS, Malaysia. Now, before we begin the discussion, I would like to kindly remind all participants of some housekeeping rules. The first one is, please respectfully ask participants to keep their microphones muted while the panelists are speaking. But you're welcome to raise any questions either through the chat box or the Q&A boxes. So without further ado, let us hear from our panelists on the topic of today's discussion, the geopolitical landscape, update on the Russian invasion of Ukraine and its impact on Indo-Pacific political security dynamic. All right, for the first one here, I would like to welcome Professor Rory McCullough on the first discussion. The Russian invasion of Ukraine has permanently changed the European security outlook and paradigm. Many believe in the beginning that there will be implications for the political security dynamic in the Indo-Pacific. How do you assess the implication of the war to the region? The floor is yours.
Look, thank you very much. And it's great to be joining you from Canberra and great to engage with such a diverse audience around the region. So thanks to FPCI and to GRIPS for convening this. It's a tough question. And of course, the short answer is it's too soon to tell, but that's not a very useful answer. We have to look at the evolving dynamic of the implications. I think some of the key messages we were already beginning to identify last year remain current. So, for example, reinforcing the idea that major power conflict or conflict involving at least one major power is a credible reality. It's a credible risk in this era, in the 2020s, is the first point. The second, of course, is that war is not easy and that outcomes for the seemingly more powerful actor in the contest do not automatically go their way. So there are obviously implications if you're looking at the Indo-Pacific, if you're thinking about possible parallels with China's threats against Taiwan, for example, to conclude that if one was studying this from a PLA perspective, one would conclude that it will complicate and slow down thinking about potential aggressive options against Taiwan. In other words, war does not pay. That's no guarantee that conflict won't happen, but it's kind of a sobering message for the region. Look, a third point to note is that we have to be ready in this region for the possibility that a major power will take aggressive action that is in breach of the principles of the UN Charter. And fourthly, that the economic consequences of any major conflict cannot be contained. There are global economic consequences and humanitarian consequences of the invasion of Ukraine. They're being felt in this region as well as other parts of the world, including Africa, for example. And it's a reminder that part of the deterrence equation to discourage conflict is to remind a potential aggressor that the economic consequences are extremely painful and probably not worth the price. Look, the last point I'll note, and we'll come back to this perhaps in the conversation, because this is a conversation mostly about the Indo-Pacific rather than about Europe, but there's a fascinating story to tell about resilience coming from the invasion of Ukraine. No matter where you stand on the conflict, and I certainly agree with Pakdino's point that this is an aggressive, brutal invasion, this is an act of aggression, but whatever one's view about the causes of the conflict, what is undeniable is the extraordinary resilience that the Ukrainian people have shown, and the fact that they've shown a kind of a resistance to imperialism, which is a message that can be understood throughout the world, including in the Indo-Pacific and the global South. And so it's a message to say that when a country with a very strong sense of national identity is provoked and has its interests trodden on and its survival threatened, that the people will rally, they will mobilise regardless of the costs that they pay. So it's a real wake-up call, in conclusion, I think, to the Indo-Pacific. And you're dead right, this is not going to end soon. So we have to be thinking about what it means for the calculations of China and the United States in particular.
Thank you, Professor Rory, for your views on this issue. I will just bring Dr. Ryo Sohashi on this discussion. How do you assess the ongoing Russian and Ukraine war? What could be the possible scenario in the following months and its impact on the Indo-Pacific political security dynamic?
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. And thank you very much for giving me opportunity today, FPCI and GRIPS. And this is my, I just want to respond to Professor Medok's view. Yes, it is really big wake-up calls to the region. And, Japan is a good example, right? Japan, after Russian-Ukrainian war or Russian invasion to Ukraine, Japanese government has decided to boost up its defense budget. Now, they try to aim to NATO standard 2% of GDP, including, many items, not only defense, but also many items. But, and Japan also, decide to introduce a strike capability. That is, the fundamental shift of Japanese SDF history after the war. The reason why Japan has changed its security policy so radically by Kishida administration, which is to be said more dovish than previous prime ministers, are kind of, their sense of urgency to respond to the situation in Russian invasion to Ukrainian war. First one is it could be, it could invite another invasion by authoritarian regime, China, to Taiwan. This is the first thing, very famous one. But the second one is also very important. That is kind of fear of abandonment, abandonment. That is, after Russian-Ukrainian war, United States, NATO countries try to respond to Ukrainian war. So that means, attention, which had been on China, shifted to the West somehow. So Japan, of course, even though Japanese government or Asian countries overall, they understand the meaning of Russian-Ukrainian war on international order. But Japan, for example, really think, now it is very important moment for Japan or regional allies to team up its powers against, this front, right? Because United States is busy now, right? So we have to share the burden on this side of the Pacific. So that is another reason, why Japanese government has decided to boost up its defense budget and defense capability. And this aspect has been missed in sometimes, but very important, It's a kind of fear of abandonment, but very important aspect. Having said that, coming back to the first aspects of moderator's question, how do I assess the ongoing Russian-Ukrainian war? And what could be the possible scenario in the following months? I think my first response is, yes, Ukrainian government tried to have counteroffensive last few months. In the very beginning, we had some more optimistic view on that, but like American media or European media says, I think we start to be more pessimistic about the easy success of counteroffensive operation by Ukrainian force, right? So we have to wait more months to go, to see the real success of Ukrainian army to make a substantial success in the front. But I think in the long run, I think the real game changer could be American presidential election in 2024 and 25. If we have a really new president from Republican camp, it could be a big game changer. So I think we have to support Ukraine. Even though we know American presidential election could be game changer, we have to support them. We have to support the Ukrainian war to keep their power, to push back Russia. That is my take.
Thank you, Dr. Yasuhashi, for your views on this issue. Dr. Ryo and Professor Rory have mentioned that this is too soon to tell, but definitely it is a wake-up call to the Indo-Pacific. And in the long term, there are few implications and possibilities that we, as Southeast Asian countries, need to prepare for. Isa Ibrahim, to you, how do you assess the response to Asia continue to the Russian invasion? Should we be worried with the possible open conflict in our region, for instance, in the Taiwan Straits, or how do you feel this?
Thank you. Good day, everyone. Thanks for having me. I think first off, when we want to assess the responses, very briefly, it's not a good one because you can see how fragmented and divergent these views are. Generally, when you want to think of these, you can split the responses into three very broad categories. So the first one, you see outright condemnation. So you see countries like Singapore, Indonesia, Brunei, were quite clear on their positions. But I will say that the language was not consistent. Singapore was probably the only case that was very explicit and probably one of the very rare cases to actually announce their economic sanctions and banning exports of military-related goods and banking transactions. But then you started seeing this gradual slip where the Indonesians were less direct, but they still condemned any actions, and by quote, that constitutes a violation of territory and sovereignty. And Brunei also slowly echoed after that too. And then in the second group, you see this ambiguous, vague sort of disapproval. So you see this coming from Vietnam, Malaysia, and the Philippines. Malaysia did say from then Prime Minister Ismail Sabri, who said he was hoping for the best possible peaceful settlement, but they were not clear on who was the problem. They never mentioned Russia. They never said who exactly was at fault. They just hoped that all parties involved would to come to the best peaceful solution that they can reach at the time. Vietnam deferred to citing the UN Charter, so emphasizing the need of self-restraint and dialogue. And the Philippines was probably one of the odd one out in this sort of group because they made it quite clear that it wasn't their place to meddle. It's not their fight. It's not their position to be making these sort of statements. And then the last one is the biggest outlier is support. And the only one there is Myanmar, who actually believed that it was it was for Russia to assert themselves as a power, and at the same time is in support of their sort of territorial claims. And further on, with this sort of confusion, it becomes quite difficult to assess how this affects their strategic outlook, because for the most part, is it a sign some do face the criticism that they don't care or they're not being good international participants because they're not being more vocal on this sort of position? But partly, I mean, to sort of ease that sort of accusations on them, it's partly also because of not only how they perceive the issues, but it's because of what sort of actions that they're very accustomed to. So I'm pretty sure everyone here is very familiar with the ASEAN way. So the whole value of non-interference, impartiality, the risk, and consensus building is really strong. So to have that sort of big, strong, united front is probably something we will not see anytime soon until, we can scenario map this into figuring out what would we need to expect, what needs to happen for all 10 countries, or at least the majority, to realize that what we're doing is not enough. And what do we have to do to make it more meaningful, to make more impact as a collective? And it's also quite important to point out that they also historically, and because of this, they have been quite neutered in that sense. It's been about, even in the past 20 years, ASEAN hasn't said anything and haven't condemned anybody. And so now we go to the question, should we be worried about open conflict? In a sense, before this, I think people will be more inclined to say no, because it seems really far off. But I think it's quite right with Dr. Metcalf and Dr. Zahashi that it's happened. All the things that everyone has been saying, like, it's not going to happen, like no country would be mad enough to do these things or would not take that type of risk. Here they are. They're doing this now. And because of that, it is quite the shock. And in effect too, like, you really have to revise, rethink, and reevaluate a lot of things that we've been coasting on since the end of World War II. And the question is, and it does pose quite implications because a lot of the latent issues in this region are territorial based. South China Sea, Taiwan, Senkaku, all of those, they're big territorial issues, and this can set a precedence. But it is a bit early to tell, but the thing is that the issue we should be worrying about is how some countries take it. Some might recognize the risk and try their best to avoid it. Some may be a bit too freaked out and might overcorrect. And I think that's where the problem is. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Isa, for your views on this as well, and to share with us like the various views from different countries in ASEAN. Just to follow up on you, Isa, the foreign minister, our vision Prime Minister Retno said that the ASEAN Ministerial Conference and Post-Ministerial Conference, the Asian Regional Forum should transform its nature from confidence-building measures to preventive diplomacy. How do you see this?
That was a good question. I think for context, one of the big takeaways from Foreign Minister Retno was to mention that, give me a second. He had a few takeaways and they were saying, good Lord, where is it? Okay. They were calling for more preventative and CBM measures that we should be including into ARF means. In theory or in practice, I think this is something that seems very intuitive for ASEAN because of the way we conduct ourselves is to socialize, build dialogue, and they're sort of building that sort of rapport we need before we can start tackling the harder questions, to build that familiarity. And the ARF is supposed to be part of this. This is supposed to be one of the big platforms that we should be using because that is where our convening power lies, next to the East Asia Summit. The thing is that it can, in theory, it's a nice idea, but the problem is that the issue is that when it doesn't work, that it will give it sets a very concerning message because if the ARF is not able to solve a particular issue, and for the longest part, not many has been, the most we've been able to do is to convene, but to reconcile or to meet conflicting views or conflicting positions, they haven't made much ground. And so because of that, you give off two very bad impressions. You have one, the accusation that ASEAN, the ARF, and its related bodies will come off as irrelevant. Because you're stuck in the beginning, but you can't take the next step because of some issue, and we haven't even gone to the difficult parts yet. And the second one is not only they just be seen as irrelevant, but they can be overtaken by other countries perhaps, or other groups as an alternative. When the region don't believe that their needs are met, they're going to start looking for options. That's quite similar, as you can see a lot of the criticisms when we see other groups such as the Quad and AUKUS coming in. Some people were wondering, is that a criticism that because ASEAN and its bodies can't do their work, other extra-regional bodies or actors are coming in to pick up the slack or to actually patch up what they couldn't? But the question is that also not only whether does the means work, but it's also the question that will the parties involved actually play ball? So far, despite the Russia and Ukraine war going on, it can be argued that they haven't actually fully derailed ASEAN mechanisms so far. The host nations have been quite firm in their positions. They did not allow for these sort of things. And also they were quite strong to resist other countries from influencing them to do things like disinvite Russia or whatnot. They were still quite firm to say, no, we're going to keep doing this because this is how ASEAN has been working. But at the same time as well, it does show that a lot of these things have a limit, and is because a lot of these institutions don't have the teeth or the sort of means to enforce the decisions. And in fact, it's also the issue too, because if they can't lobby, these are the opportunities for countries to lobby. And if they aren't able, and these are perfect opportunities for like Ukraine to actually push for their position. But so far, because of the sort of influence they have, you don't actually see much ground happening there. At the same time as well, and this is where I go back to the point of we need to make the hard decisions. Are countries willing to do something beyond just the empty platitudes and statements, or are they actually willing to move forward? Because if not, you'd be moving away from the main basis of what confidence building measures is. Like you'd have to push aside, make the hard decisions, and then just go on regardless of what other people are thinking, even if it's coming from your own unit. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Isa, on responding to that. Let's invite Dr. Ryo Sohashi to the next question. Will the Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida and South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol participated in the NATO summit this year, and there is a plan to open a NATO office in Japan. How do you read this?
Thank you. Thank you very much for that interesting question. As many of you know, NATO had a plan to establish a new liaison office in Tokyo, but that plan has been blocked or prevented by French opposition. So the idea is still in the air. But I think a liaison office thing might cause some misunderstanding. It is not a big thing. This is not the kind of representative office. Only one people will come from NATO Secretariat to represent NATO position and also collect information in Tokyo. But of course, even if that function is very small, NATO never have representative or liaison office in Asia, so it could be something new. So that makes some news value. But we shouldn't misunderstand. This is just only one people's office, and it could be very small, even if it happens. And secondly, we don't expect NATO will have a discussion of Article 5 on the situation of Asia, like a Taiwan contingency. Article 5 is the most important article in NATO, which will function NATO as a one ally against aggressor. But we really don't think NATO will have such an Article 5 discussion on Asian situation. We don't have such a perception on NATO. And also, we really don't think Japan or Korea or other AP4 member like Australia or New Zealand will join NATO, right? That is also a very groundless discussion. Japan, South Korea, at least have no dream to join NATO, right? What most important for us is to team up against China and also against North Korea, right? The really good example recently is Japan, South Korea, United States trilateral summit, which took place this weekend. And they decided a lot of things. And actually, it's a joint statement and some, supplemental documents are really interesting, which I really recommend you to read, by Google them. But they really say they want to have commitment to each other, even though two alliances are still separated and no formal umbrella for three countries. But they really want to make two alliances functions as one group against a potential aggressors. So this is a big thing, right? And this is more feasible for us, right? And more meaningful, substantial. So what is the meaning of NATO, a NATO liaison office? Of course, we support that idea, but the reason we support it is first, we really want NATO countries to know more about Asia-Pacific security situations, including Chinese behaviors and the future scenario of Chinese aggression to the region, and also North Korea. And even though we don't expect a lot to their military involvement so much to Asia-Pacific situation, some country can do anyway, but we don't expect the big NATO collective actions against Asian Pacific situation. But in economic affairs, we really need their help, right? Like economic sanctions or cyber things, or we really have many things we should collaborate even without having the Article 5 discussion of NATO. So I think NATO things is a little bit tricky, but we really want them to join the discussion. But we don't have very high expectation on NATO countries on Asia Pacific. That is my answer.
Okay, thank you, Doctor. Before I open up on the public discussion with the audience, I'll just remind everybody, if you do have any questions, please send it over to the chat box and our admin will send it over to me and I will ask the questions later. After our last speaker from Professor Robert McCall, what do you think of the idea of ASEAN Quad engagement? Do you think this initiative is possible?
So that's an interesting question, and I guess it is slightly tangential to the Ukraine theme, but it does point to that broader question of what kind of wide web of solidarity can we build in favour of peace, stability, and the norms and rules, I think, that, for example, underpin the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific and indeed the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation. So I think we've reached an important point in the evolution of the Quad, the quadrilateral dialogue among Australia, Japan, the United States, and India, because it's very clear now that most of the work of the Quad, I think, is about public goods, and it's about building the Quad as a kind of island of trust and cooperation on a whole range of issues like technology, like medicine and health, like countering climate change, like sharing data on maritime security, protecting fisheries, and so forth. In other words, an agenda that is quite consistent with the connectivity and the public goods that ASEAN seeks to provide, and that ASEAN countries have built up a strong track record on in recent years. So I think if we're not too ambitious, if we're realistic about points of engagement between the Quad and ASEAN, the Quad communiques constantly emphasise ASEAN centrality. As I've seen it, at least individual ASEAN countries and indeed ASEAN collectively are becoming more understanding and accepting that the Quad is not a threat to ASEAN centrality. I can see case-by-case examples of projects or activities where the Quad and ASEAN can cooperate, but I don't see some kind of grand architectural solution where they effectively join forces across the board. And I don't think that matters. I don't think that's what we're looking for. I think underlying all of this is the fact that the Quad members individually are all such good ASEAN dialogue partners, and that the interpretation of the ASEAN vision that they support is one that, for example, reinforces some of those principles we saw in the establishment of actually the ASEAN Regional Forum. I want to echo back to some earlier comments that our colleague from Malaysia was making previously, and that is that we still need to try to use the regional security architecture to prevent conflict, to build confidence, to increase stability and equilibrium. Yes, that's incredibly difficult to do. Yes, the consensus rule within ASEAN and the principle of moving at a pace comfortable to all in the ASEAN Regional Forum is incredibly difficult. But if you look back at the origins of these institutions, at the ASEAN Regional Forum in the 1990s, there was a very clear expectation of preventing conflict. In fact, the vision of the founders of the ARF and other regional institutions, the EAS, were in fact thinking about a future where the risk of major conflict would be real. That future has come faster and harder than we expected, but it's too soon to be giving up on the institutions. So I think a lot of creative work needs to be taking place in the second track, think tanks, institutions, and experts like those in this room, not to force these institutions to suddenly come to consensus head on, they won't, but to actually get serious about the confidence building agenda, transparency measures, risk monitoring, and so forth, because that's one of the lessons from the Ukraine war and from Russia's invasion of Ukraine. There's been a failure of institutions. I think we can't be despairing here in the Indo-Pacific, here in Asia. We actually have to say to our institutions, it's time to step up. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. I hope everyone in this discussion have quite a clear background information about the issue in this Indo-Pacific region and various perspective as well in accordance to different countries in our neighboring friends. So now I will open up a public discussion. Just to remind you that please respectfully ask participants to keep your microphone muted while the panelists are speaking, as well as when questions are being made. But you're welcome to raise any questions through the Zoom or through the YouTube chat box. But due to time constraint, we ask participants to deliver the question concisely, and if possible, direct a question to one speaker only. But before we open up, we actually have 4 questions at the moment that we've gathered from the chat box. So I'll open up the first question to probably Professor Rory. But with reference to the increasing close relationship that is being developed between Japan, Australia, and India, especially with respect to the Quad and joint military exercise, how do Japan and Australia reconcile with the stand taken by India vis-a-vis the Russia-Ukraine war?
Thank you for that difficult question. It's an excellent question, and there's a lot of thought behind it. You know, it depends a little bit as to what you see as the purpose of the Quad and the purpose of the strategic partnership among these countries, Australia, India, Japan, and the United States, including our bilaterals and trilaterals as well as the Quad. Now, I think we have to accept the reality that the Indian position on Russia and Ukraine is not, for the time being, going to be the position that a country like Australia would like. I don't like using terms like the West to describe, if you like, coalitions of countries with shared values and principles in terms of a liberal democratic order, because not all of those countries are located in Western Europe, and not all of those countries necessarily are European in their cultural institutional origins. But I think that India is not a fully fledged member of that partnership, and nobody is pretending that. I think, therefore, Quad partners like Japan, Australia, and the United States need to continue to work with India in largely an interests and principles-based approach to preserving stability in the Indo-Pacific, while recognising that we won't have the same position on Russia and Ukraine immediately. But we need to do 2 things to try to move that dial. I think, firstly, we do need to be very honest and forthright in our private conversations with India about this, just as I think a country like Australia needs to be very honest and forthright in our private diplomatic dialogues with some of our partners in Southeast Asia as well on this, reinforcing what an affront Russia's behaviour is to the principles of the UN Charter, and also why there's an interest-based reason to be reducing strategic relations with Russia. You know, the very fact that Russian weaponry, Russian munitions, which India wants and needs, are there for, from an Indian perspective, are for building deterrence against China. However, the disastrous way in which Putin's war is proceeding means that Russia is becoming weaker. I don't see an outcome of the war that does not involve a weaker Russia. China is becoming stronger relative to Russia. Russia is more dependent on China. Therefore, if India or any other recipient of Russian weapons in future asks Russia for help while in a confrontation with China, the answer will be no. And I think we have to help get that interest-based message through, which I think is gradually happening.
Thank you, Professor. I think Dr. Shaharsi might have any views on this. Would you like to answer?
Oh, yes. India is always a very difficult question for us, right? But I totally agree with Professor Medukov said. In addition to that, I think, we have to look India from broader perspective or longer perspective, right? Because under the table, under the, ground, Indian strategic communities discussion really shifted, and, in 10 years, I'm pretty sure they will be more aligned with United States, Japan, European countries, Australia, and ASEAN, they will be more with us, right? But now they are still struggling, with the power of Russia and China, because they cannot ignore them, right? But we have to look at the kind of very gigantic shift under the table on India. And this is the first thing. And the second thing is, Quad is a framework which has many substantial but functional cooperation, very functional, even including a technological cooperation or scholarship and so many things. So I think these substantial and functional cooperation will make more merit and advantage in coming decades. So I think, and after decades, India's power will be more big. Will be more important in the world politics. So I think a Quad should be, look by this kind of longer perspective, right? Of course, it is very, very pity for us to see Indians' behavior after a Russian-Ukrainian war. But that doesn't mean we have to give up India. So I think, we still have very big expectation on India in the longer term scenario. So.
Okay, thank you, Doctor. I hope this answered your question. It was a question from Captain Banaji from the question list. We have here Muhammad Izamu, who have raised your hand. Would you like to ask your question? And please also address who this question is for.
Okay, thank you very much for the opportunity and thank you very much for the material. I want to ask for in the country, how long for your country with the war in Ukraine has also highlight the need to more cooperation and coordination among the countries in the region to enhance their collective defense and defense. Do you accept that? And how long you accept this to Ukraine? Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you for your question. Was that quite clear?
I had trouble hearing. There was background noise.
Okay, if I may recap, probably how long will it take for your country with the situation with the war in Ukraine decide on the cooperation amongst other countries? Is that the question, Muhammad Izamu? Muhammad Izamu, would you like to reconfirm the question?
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So my question is, we know that Ukraine and Russia until now is war. My question is, for all countries, my question is, the war in Ukraine I also highlight the need for more cooperation and coordination among the countries in the region to enhance their collective defense and defense. My question is, do you accept that for your country to help in Ukraine and Russia together again? Thank you.
Okay. Well, did you get that?
I'm happy to comment. I don't know if I fully got the message because there was, I think, music or something in the background. But I think that, look, the first point I'd make is that nobody's going to be forgiving Russia anytime soon. I think that tragically, the invasion has deeply alienated the people of Ukraine, particularly against Putin and his regime, but I think against the broader Russian frankly, aggression and an imperial war machine there. So, peace is not going to be easy. And it's very clear from the Ukrainian resistance to Russia's aggression and the way in which Europe has actually mobilized and others have mobilized to support Ukraine that, peace is not going to be on any terms. I think peace is going to be on terms that I think the people of Ukraine find acceptable for the sacrifices they've made. So I think we have to accept the reality that any kind of reconciliation is an incredible distance into the future. I think instead what we need to focus on is what does this mean for the new normal in Europe? I think, and I've recently done research consultations in various parts of Europe, and the hardening of the European security posture is not to be underestimated. There's a new spirit of national resilience and putting security ahead of economic prosperity as a #1 priority. So we'll see, I think, a much tougher security situation in Europe for many years to come. And I think the question that I take away from that is actually how much capacity, how much capability will Europe have to engage as a security partner in the Indo-Pacific? But at the same time, I think there's a new determination in Europe to resist authoritarian coercion. So that will ensure Europe takes some interest in the Indo-Pacific, though not directly a military one.
Okay, thank you, Professor. There's another question. This is for Isa. Are we expecting too much from ASEAN regarding this geopolitical risk? What is the alternative? Won't ASEAN, even its ineffective form, continue to exist simply because there really isn't an alternative for countries in Southeast Asia? For example, businesses do not place investment in ASEAN programs as they are vague and aspirational. Maybe a more practical way is approaching each member state bilaterally. This is from Raymond from DHL. Would you like to answer that?
Sure, I'll try. Thanks for the question. Yes, this is a very common criticism because oops, that's not what focus. Yeah. The criticism's always that yes, they're knocked on for not doing enough, but the minute we go, what are the alternatives? We have nothing. ASEAN is the argument, it has the, I guess, the network, it has the history, and it has the, I guess, the closest thing to capacity to work. In the question of are we expecting too much, I'll set a disclaimer. I'm a bit more critical of how ASEAN works. I really do believe that they can be doing more, and they just need the will for it. Partly, you can say it is part of their purview to be dealing with some, not all of these issues, because they are still expected to be maintaining the stability and peace for the region. And if they're not doing that in some ways, or from, like, say, ensuring the cooperation of its members and its dialogue partners, for that matter, because of some of them did sign on to the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation. If they're not doing that, then they're not doing their job. The reason ASEAN is there in the first place. So then that's part of that. And also the fact that if they weren't, then we wouldn't be seeing a proliferation, or if not almost too much, of subgroups and other mechanisms under the ASEAN umbrella to be addressing many of these issues. But I will address a disclaimer that, compared to their economic, social, political, the sort of people-to-people cooperation, defense is one of their weakest, partly because it is to them an issue. It is too sensitive for them. That's why you have these very, you have the type of defense cooperation they only want to do is very lowest common denominator type. So like military aid, humanitarian efforts, and what have you. But that's why I say that to replace or to create an alternative at the moment may not be the best option, because to do a massive overhaul, I don't think there's the will for it, and neither will there be an appetite to see that change, which is why I was saying more of that. The smaller changes, let's say like streamlining the subgroups and organizations, introducing enforcement mechanisms, because we have quite a fair bit of agreements, declarations, and all that did highlight some of these issues should they come to light. And I feel like all we need to do is just support them rather than push them aside and add 50 more statements to them. But yes, I will also agree that they are also very vague and aspirational. But at the same time, this doesn't mean they should be discounted. There is a bit of that optimism and hope that I feel that we shouldn't be pushing under the rug despite all of these conflicts. We should just be adding more things. So, the sort of identity building, network building, consensus building, they can still exist, but I think we should be also giving space for smaller groups to take initiatives as opposed to stifling them. Thank you.
Thank you, Isa, for your answer. I hope that answer your question, Mr. Raymond from VHL. I'll just move on to Mr. Muhtar Ahmad. I think he's from Natuna. Please give your questions and who are you addressing the question to?
Thank you very much. I would like to ask my distinguished Mr. Rory. You say that if we want to know about the landscape of geopolitics where the Russian-Ukraine still haven't, we must calculate China and United States. Natuna is not far from Spread Island. Spread Island now China make it as the defense base for military. So what do you think about the strengths of China military at Spread Island? And how about the influence for the small island around it? Because if there is the war and Spread Island as the base of China, so what will happen and what do you think about it? Thank you very much.
That's a big question, and I don't think I can offer a particularly forensic capability view of the rapid increase of military facilities and presence in the Spratlys or indeed elsewhere in the South China Sea in recent years. The most important point to note is, of course, we all know China has established and militarized artificial islands. I don't like the word land reclamation because there was no land there before. The word reclamation is completely fake. It's new land, it's militarized islands. I think that if you're looking at capability in the military balance, in the coercion of relatively small, weak local forces, I mean, the coercion of, for example, Coast Guard forces, or the coercion that we've seen against our friends in the Philippines in recent months. Of course, China is bringing a preponderant military and paramilitary capability to bear in the ability to monitor the waters and to make threats to, for example, passing warships or passing aircraft, or challenges, I should say. Again, China's presence is formidable. But in an overall warfighting sense, we have to still put question marks. I think this is very much still in the balance. And the answer to your question really depends what kind of scenarios we're thinking about in the future. If you're thinking about limited skirmishes, then the contest is still going to be a contest of political will rather than a contest of the amount of capability. And if you're thinking about major conflict in which the United States gets involved, then I have to say that the Chinese island bases in the South China Sea are targets. And because they're targets, it depends really, again, on how much capability the United States is willing to bring to bear. So my simple answer is a lot of this is about perception rather than reality, and it's about how much risk each side is willing to take and how much deterrence we're willing to show. So I think the lesson there for friends in Indonesia is to continue to build up enough maritime capability to show that you're serious about protecting your interests.
Thank you, Professor Rory, for your answer. I hope this answered your question, Pak from Natuna. Of course, it's a very in sort of proximity is very close to where you are questioning from, Spratly Island. I'd like to continue on the question from Tom O'Sullivan from Methoist Advisory, Japan. One of the senior Republican candidates in the U.S. presidential election, Governor Chris Christie, opened yesterday that he thinks the Ukraine war is a proxy war by China against the West because of China's support for Russia in oil and military equipment support. Do panel members agree with that characterism? Please, if anyone wants to answer, please do.
I'm happy to hear from somebody else, but I'll join in. I have an opinion, but I'm curious to hear what other speakers think.
Yeah, so maybe I can go first. So ideally, don't think, this view, China is not that supportive to Russia. That's all, right? So, of course, China still on that side, and, recent months, Chinese relationship with Russian counterpart are getting higher. But still, we don't think, Russian-Ukrainian war is 100% strategic opportunity for China. There is some aspect, Russian-Ukrainian war means strategic liability on China's borders. So I think, this is not proxy war. This is a war started by Russian aggression to Ukraine. This is very simple. But another aspect we shouldn't forget is North Korea start to get a real big advantage from this war. That is more important, right? Just today's report also echoes the view that North Korea having more technological support on their missile program from Russia. That is more important, to lead the implications from this Russian-Ukrainian war, I think. So ideally, don't take this view. This is not a proxy war by China.
Thank you, Dr. Sahasi. Would you like to answer that?
Yeah, look, I actually agree entirely with that. And the point that I wanted to make was that if the war had been quick and easy and successful from a Russian point of view, then I think China, the Chinese leadership would have been very pleased. I think that there was effectively a green light given by Xi Jinping to Vladimir Putin to go ahead with some kind of aggression. But this is not the war that China wanted. I mean, this is a disaster. It's actually making Russia weaker. It's making Europe more robust. And I think it's waking us all up to the risks of major war. So I think China's support for Russia will be limited. However, China does not want to see Russia catastrophically lose. And so begrudgingly, it may increase its support, including, I think, enabling the Russian armed forces, if that can be done without leaving a strong sort of intelligence trail. And that's an interesting question mark.
Yeah, I'll just add a little bit as well, just to pull this a little bit further back. I have a beef with these types of interpretations because not only is it grossly reductive, and it's highlighting this issue that we tend to do when it comes to conflicts. It's that we tend to, there's nothing wrong of drawing historical lessons or past examples, but we shouldn't be trying to shove the current with the old. So I guess a good example is the current US-China competition that some countries or some observers would really like to call this the next Cold War. China is not the Soviet Union. US is in a completely different space and time that they are then to now. And I feel that by doing this, you really cut out the actual intentions, the agency, and the considerations of China or any other party involved whenever we do these types of scenario mapping and theorizing, that by doing that, we end up falling into this trap that opens up to actually more complications or miscalculations. And I feel like this is something that we need to highlight more, because in more in general discussion, this seems to be quite a common pitfall.
Thank you for all of your answers for this question. I'll just move on to the next one. There's two questions for Professor Rory from Tatsuo Shikata. The first one is, economic sanctions against China must be much more challenging for the West than sanctions against Russia, since China is so densely interconnected with the Western economy. In case of Taiwan contingency, do you think the West can be united? That's the first one. And the second one is, do you think France is the weakest link, since they always pay due consideration to China? How about USA in case of Trump or a Trump-like person is elected as a president? Would you like to answer?
Wow, these are such good questions. Look, firstly, I think that it's not especially helpful to be looking for sort of weakest link countries. I would use both hands, but I've just got a broken shoulder at the moment. So it's not that helpful to be saying which country is the weakest link, because the reality is much more sophisticated about it. On some issues, some European or other democratic countries are going to have certain dependencies or enmeshment with China. I mean, obviously in the case of Australia, we've got extraordinary reliance on China as a market for our iron ore exports. So I'm a bit reluctant as an Australian to be accusing anybody of being a weak link in that regard. But at the same time, the general direction is that European countries and many democracies are de-risking elements of their relations with China. And I think, especially in Europe, that story is real, even in Germany, actually. That is not the same as to say that there will be some miraculous solidarity of economic sanctions if there were to be a Taiwan conflict. I think the more interesting thing to watch for is the risk assessments being made by the private sector, because I think the very real economic deterrent signal that many countries can begin giving to China to say, don't go and catastrophically ruin the regional and global economy by invading Taiwan, is to say that the day the conflict begins, the moment the conflict begins, private sector economic actors all over the world are going to make risk-based decision to reduce their exposure to China and to get out of China, or to get out of the maritime region around China, even if they're not making a moral decision, they're simply making a commercial risk-based decision. And I think governments in Europe and Australia and elsewhere will be in step with that risk-based decision, even if they find it difficult to make really hard-edged sanctions work. So either way, there is a genuine economic signal that can and should be marshaled, and it should be done now as a deterrent to discourage the Chinese leadership from taking such crazy risks with all of our economic futures in the first place.
Thank you, Professor Rory, for your answer. I'll give another chance if anyone would like to raise any question. I saw Michaela before. Would you like to ask a question? The floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you so much, ma'am. My name is Michaela from Senior High Global Islamic School, Jakarta, and I will be delivering my question to His Excellency, Mr. Rio Sahashi, but I will be very happy if other panel members are to answer as well. And so my question is, what potential effects could the ongoing situation between Russia and Ukraine have on the regional balance of power and security arrangements in the Indo-Pacific? Or could the tension between both of those countries potentially divert the attention of countries in the Indo-Pacific away from addressing their own security concerns? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michaela. Would you like to answer the question, Professor?
Yeah, to me, right? Okay, thank you very much. Excellent question. And the point of your question is the impact on military balance of power or balance of power overall, right? Caused by Russian-Ukrainian war on Indo-Pacific. So it is very important, right? And even in the United States, many people, hawkish people, who really want to focus more on China and Taiwan, always criticize, Biden administration's stance on Ukrainian war, because by this arrangement they cannot concentrate on Indo-Pacific situations. So as I say, now the resource or power is something say everybody try to get attention, right? So after Russian-Ukrainian war, it is true, not only European countries, but United States pay so much attention to Russian-Ukrainian war. So in a very concrete terms, it start to delay the process of arms transfer to Taiwan. This is very, very clear. The United States cannot deliver the promised arms sales to Taiwan because of Russian-Ukrainian war. So it started to have that impact on the, Indo-Pacific politics. But having said that, another very important thing is, as I said in the very previous, in the very, first comment, Japan, for example, try to say, pay more to defense budget, and same to South Korea. South Korea start to be more serious beyond Korean Peninsula, right? Of course, this is very understandable. South Korean people always try to focus on Korean Peninsula because they are coexisted with North Korea, but they start to, discuss beyond Korean Peninsula. So I think, that is evidence that, the balance of power start to be, say, weakened or favored more to authoritarian regimes, even in Indo-Pacific. But because we know that, we try to push back to the military balance of power, right? So we try to team up, not only among the Northeast Asian countries like Japan, South Korea, and the United States, but also Australia, Japan, and the United States. We team up very well. And, and UK. UK are also very important member for this coalition building. So I think, as you said very clearly, we know balance of power start to be shaken in the Pacific after the war. But by realizing that facts, everybody try to, spend more resources in this region and try to, I can say, sustain US interest in this region too. And NATO interests are also welcome, as I said previously.
Thank you, Dr. Sahashi. We do have a lot of very interesting questions and discussion delivered during this session, but unfortunately we are 10 minutes away to ending this panel discussion. It has been very interesting, but before we close the session, I would like to invite all speakers to please provide your closing statement. I would like to invite Professor Rory first.
Look, thank you. This has been a really, I think, important and useful conversation, and I think it's really pleasing that colleagues from right across the region, from across Southeast Asia and the broader Indo-Pacific are tuning in, because it reinforces the view that the invasion of Ukraine, that kind of aggression, a threat to global order, it cannot be quarantined as if that's purely Europe's problem. It is a global challenge, and the signals being read out of the Ukraine invasion will either embolden aggression or discourage aggression. And in fact, the leadership decisions that are made in our countries and the diplomacy that our countries, the statecraft that our countries choose to enact in response to the invasion of Ukraine will help determine the future of peace and stability in the Indo-Pacific. So I encourage more conversations like this. I think fruitful room for investigation and research include, I think, the sorts of areas that Isa from Malaysia was saying earlier, that is looking at the regional institutions, the multilateral forums, but also small groups. How do we help them live up to their promise of confidence building, preventive diplomacy, that I think, guardrails, as I think the Americans call it, risk reduction, that I think is the most important area of rapid scholarship and research we should be encouraging in our dialogues at the moment. So thank you again for involving me.
Thank you, Professor Rory, for your time. It is obviously very important to have your point of view, and we would also like to invite Isa for the closing statement.
Yeah, thank you very much. It was really thought-provoking, this entire session. It was a pleasure to be part of this. And I think this is one thing to remind ourselves. I kind of briefly mentioned this earlier, that because a lot of things are currently are in development, and a lot of it is subject to speculation, I think we have to be very careful on how we perceive and how do you respond to these changes. We shouldn't be jumping the gun unnecessarily and and consider what are the best options. We shouldn't be by overreacting or overcorrecting actions. I think will be more of a danger as opposed to being more mindful of how we respond, either as a group or as individual countries. And also with what was it Dr. Metcalf was mentioning too, it's the question of proximity. We shouldn't be brushing this over. Even the effects are being felt quite greatly in Southeast Asia as well. Despite we're far, far away from where Ukraine is. And because of that too, and it highlights the final thing, the message as well, is that as much as there are criticisms about being too soft or being talk shops or not being as forceful with some of the decisions, I still think that there is still merit to these methods. It's just knowing how to best coordinate and leverage them with the other options that we have. And I think by doing that, we have that proper holistic solution and pathways to actually build long-lasting changes as opposed to just slapping a band-aid on the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Isa, for that closing statement. I would like to invite Dr. Sahasi for the last closing.
Yeah, thank you very much. Excellent discussions by my colleagues, and also excellent questions and comments from audience. I really appreciate all of them. And just 2 comments. First thing is, yes, as Professor Metcalf said, it is very important for us to know, realize Russian-Ukrainian war or Russia's aggressions is the world problem. But also, this is just a flip side, other side of the point of the Metcalf said. That is, this war or in Ukraine, really headache to European security. We have to know that. And the security of Europe is really important for all of us, right? That is a very important, aspects or the parts of world economy or world society, right? We have to understand their worries, right? Ukrainian war is not something very far away. That is really next to Europe or part of Europe, right? So we really have to know this is really serious about our own, international society. And the second thing is we have to also, we didn't have time to discuss, but now Chinese economy is going to a new stage after Evergrande, bankrupt in the United States, right? We will see more weaker China, right? But what is the implication from weaker economy of China? We can sleep well? I don't know. More uncertainty will come after this, collapse of Chinese economy. Maybe not collapse, but a really big break on Chinese growth, right? So we really have to, think more about the implication from weaker China discussion. But maybe next time we can discuss. So thank you very much for listening to my remarks, and thank you very much. We want to see you more.
Thank you so much, Professor Rory Metcalf, Dr. Ria Sahashi, Isa Ibrahim, for your time to be with us here today, and everyone here. As you all know, the public discussion really is open for public, from high school students to professionals to those living in proximities to several strategic areas. So I really appreciate having everyone here today, the audience, the speakers, as well as the distinguished guests that we have today. We do want to invite everyone to follow FPCI social media platform if you haven't, so you can get more updates and future public dialogues and awareness on various issues in foreign policy. And there is an interesting discussion and event coming up in the 2nd of September, which is the Global Town Hall. So if you are having any free time, or if you'd like to join, please do. The information is on the link at the chat box, as well as on FPCI social media. I will hand over this public discussion to the MC Dito, but I would like to personally thank everyone to be here, and hopefully I can see you again in the next public discussion. Good.
Thank you.
Thank you, Manisha, for moderating today's discussion, and thank you to all the speakers for sharing your incredible insights. Before we close, I would like to invite the speakers for a short photo session. So please open your camera, everyone. So the operator will direct you for the photo session. Okay, 1, 2, 3, and once more. 1, 2, 3. Okay, thank you so much. It has been a very fruitful discussion, and I'm sure that every audience here already enjoying, and I found the session is very interesting and informative. Today's event is available to rewatch at on FPCI YouTube channel at Secretariat FPCI. And also, like Mbak Nesha already said, on 2nd September 2023, FPCI, together with our partner, Global Citizen, will once again convene the Global Town Hall, which is a North, South, East, West 15 hours marathon online discussion discussing the state of the world and other topics of common interest. Over the years, we have attracted 11,000 audience from over 142 countries and partnered with over 100 institutions, including think tanks, universities, and civil society organizations from around the world. So, ladies and gentlemen, save the date and see you at our virtual Global Town Hall on 2nd September and register at gth2023.com. So thank you everybody for tuning in to today's discussion. You can follow our social media handles for more information about our activities, event, and programs. Also stay tuned to our next FPCI Grips virtual public forum via Instagram or Twitter at FPCI Indo. And see you at the next FPCI event.